All right, we are live. I am joined today by Dr. Job Fransen. Job, do you want to introduce yourself real quick to people who might not be familiar with you?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Job. Nice to be here, and thanks, Josh, for the invitation.
Thank you.
Um, I'm an academic by trade, or as my background, and I work at Charles Sturt University, which is a very relatively small regional university in Australia. It's located somewhere between Brisbane and Sydney for those people who listen and have been to Australia yet. Um, my background is in skill acquisition science, so I love to understand how people learn motor skills. That includes people who are not very good at learning them, as well as experts. But more recently, my focus has shifted a bit to trying to understand what the level of evidence is that we have for some of the claims that we make about skill learning. It seems that everyone and their dog has written a book about how people should be learning skills. The question is what's written in those books actually evidence based? And I focus specifically on team sports. I
Okay.
also have a practitioner background, and I work mostly in North America in team sports, but also in Australia and a little bit in Europe.
Okay. Very cool. Are you? So I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach. Are you familiar with Jiu-Jitsu at all? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Almost nothing. I would have
Okay.
seen a little bit here and there on TV or something like that, but I would have no knowledge of anything that you do.
Okay. So it's basically like you've seen like the UFC and mixed martial arts and stuff like that. So it's basically diet decaf UFC. It's
Hmm.
it's like the grappling, choking each other part of it, but just without punching each other in the face and stuff. So
Yeah.
just sort of a gentle version of that kind of stuff, and a little bit of a different crowd, but it's in some ways it's very similar to wrestling. It's primarily a recreational sport, although there are like professional jiu-jitsu athletes who compete, but it's not a well-developed deep sport in the way that like wrestling or boxing or anything like that is as far as combat sports go.
Yeah.
um,
And I assume it's not Olympic like judo, for
no,
example. No, no.
no, there are organizations, like we have our organizations where the top athletes compete, but there's no Olympic presence at all, and it's not at the same like athletic level as an Olympic sport would be. So
Yeah. Which
yeah.
kind of makes it interesting. It's less constrained than in terms of things you can try and how you can apply your creativity. You're not necessarily bound by certain methods or achieving performance within a few years or in an Olympic cycle, etc., which is kind of nice. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool.
It's interesting because one thing that I like about jiu-jitsu is that there's no, like, there are some dominant governing bodies as far as the sport goes, but it's not like a complete monopoly on the sport that these governing bodies have. So there's all kinds of different rule sets and
Hmm.
different ways of doing jiu-jitsu, and they sort of interface with other sports in different ways. So it really is kind of like this weird like generic grappling sport where there is a lot of freedom to do, you know, different rule sets, different ways of expressing it, and
Mm.
experimenting with different ways of learning. So
Yeah, and I guess in my kind of profession, the way that I think about it is that the moment you have performance criteria that you're supposed to strive for, right? It's sometimes you start looking at things that are efficacious or effective in the literature. In other words, you go and look for interventions that people claim are beneficial, because if you waste your Olympic cycle or the 2 years of preparing an athlete on things that are perhaps creative but have no scientific backing, then you might be wasting your time, right? So if you have this massive pressure to perform, you instantly go and look for evidence-based methods of training. The interesting thing is we actually don't have that many evidence-based methods of training, especially not in the context of team sports. And I'll just to jump straight in, we recently did a big scoping review, which is a type of systematic search through the literature, where we went and looked at what if we examined all of the really high level experiments that exist in skill acquisition science. And when we went and looked looked at all of the literature, we found, I think, about 120 odd experiments that were done where they tested some sort of skill acquisition intervention. And while the goal of that review was not to necessarily test whether those skill acquisition interventions were beneficial, the interesting thing we saw is that 86 or 87% of all of these experiments said that their method worked. And that's interesting because purely by chance or logically, this is almost impossible, right?
Right.
If you test something, we should see a whole lot of studies that actually find no beneficial effect. So when we started looking at this literature, then we saw that, well, everyone's claiming that whatever they do works. And I think that kind of represents a lot of the way in which our skill acquisition field is divided now. Everyone has their kind of baby, and I'm really into this method and I'm really into this method. And what people do once they are so invested in a particular method is they have something called confirmation bias. So they basically, every single explanation in the world around them, they're going to explain in the context of the fact that this method is beneficial. So I'll give an example. Right, let's say that you apply a very specific method of jujitsu training, and you're really known for that. The people who come to your facility, they come specifically to learn this particular method. If that method shows not to improve the performance of your athlete, you'll find something else that improves. You'll say, yeah, but my athletes are more resilient, or yeah, but my athletes like jujitsu better than other athletes. So you'll always find something different to try and confirm your prior hypothesis. And obviously, what we saw in the literature is that most of the studies that are published show this beneficial effect. That is partially because people love confirming their own hypotheses, but also because there are probably a lot of studies that have been published where people don't find beneficial effects of an intervention, and they are put in a file drawer. We call it the file drawer effect or publication bias. And because those people put away their negative findings or their null findings, it looks in the literature like everything is beneficial. But in fact, if you were to include all of the studies that are in the file drawer, then you would actually see that that effect is way, way, way smaller. And in fact, for some of these interventions, the effect might entirely disappear. I'll give an example of that. For example, something that you surely use in jiu-jitsu a lot is feedback. In a skill acquisition perspective, we call it augmented feedback. It is any feedback that doesn't come from you as the source. It's not your feelings or your sentiments or the things you perceive or hear, etc., but it is feedback that is given on top of that, like a coach's instruction. You might watch a video of yourself grappling. You might have some sort of other biofeedback or anything like that. The general consensus in the literature was always that you should withdraw feedback as much as possible, right? That you should not give feedback too frequently, that you should try and focus specifically on feedback about the process of why someone achieved a particular outcome, not necessarily about the outcome in beginners and maybe vice versa in experts. So there was this whole kind of understanding about what the best method was to deliver feedback. Now, we went and we looked at the literature to try and see if we could find any support for those claims. And what we can find is that augmented feedback works, right? The studies very likely show a beneficial effect of the fact that athletes who get feedback accelerate their learning faster and retain information for longer. But when we looked at all of these modalities, we actually didn't find any effect. So despite the fact that every single person who studies kinesiology is taught to give feedback in a specific way, there is actually no support in the literature whatsoever about the way that you should be providing feedback. So this is a typical example of something that we've been told for so long that we assume is true, And if no one actually studies whether it is actually true, it remains just something that we do year in, year out, and we assume that this is a practice that we should be doing. And the longer we do it, the more ingrained it becomes, and the more difficult it becomes to disprove that that's actually necessary. So what we know now is that feedback is important, but it doesn't really matter, or at least we don't know whether it matters when you give it, how you give it, what you say. In fact, in a more recent large experiment, we see that it might be that the motivational effect of augmented feedback, the fact that someone is actually saying something to you, that you can see your own performance, regardless of what you actually see there, is that it's not the feedback itself that makes you better, but the fact that it motivates you or it engages you. And that's something that we see in a more recent experiment that hasn't been published just yet. So that's just to give the listeners a perspective of what is it that I do. Well, you can see me as a kind of, let's call me a miner of the research. I dig through it and I try to separate the things we don't need from the true value, or where we can find real value to improve people's skill learning.
So I think that's great. That's a lot of really useful information there. So like I when you were talking about the confirmation bias, I thought of two opposing examples that I can think of. So in jiu-jitsu, and I think this is true in most sports, where there is rote repetition, right? So maybe somebody does something 100 times on their left side, 100 times on the right side, and maybe the rep ranges, there might be short rep ranges like 3 to 5 times on one side, or 100 times. I know there's a difference between those two things, but let's just say, for the example, one coach says, "I want you to do this thing 100 times on your left side." And then you have another coach that says, "Okay, well, you don't need to do that. That's bullshit. You can do just small sided games to develop that same thing. And if you do the small sided games, you're going to develop creative responses, you're going to develop adaptability and certain qualities that you're going to build skill, but then you have all these other qualities." And then if we go
Mm-hmm.
back to coach A and they're talking about the 100 reps, then they might say, well, you're going to develop automaticity and precision and physical conditioning if you do it this way. And you have two
Mm-hmm.
different methods. And in jiu-jitsu, as far as practical results go, there are people who do A and people who do B, and the results really aren't that different. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are coaches that do primarily constraints-led approach stuff that in competitive jiu-jitsu do quite well. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also plenty of coaches that do rote repetition in addition to a lot of live work that also do quite well. And there's no clear, in competitive jiu-jitsu, no clear superior method. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I find is that when people try to justify the methods that they use, they make certain claims like, if you drill this 100 times, it's going to do X, Y, and Z. Or if you don't drill at all and you just do live work in maybe small sided jiu-jitsu games and build your skill that way, you're going to get X, Y, and Z results.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really hard to understand who who to really who to really believe, because they both
Mm-hmm.
get basically the same results.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And there's a few things that I should focus on here. The first thing is experiential knowledge, right? I've worked with some of the world's best performers in, have or do still work either in the NBA, the NFL, the European, or the English Premier League here in Australia. I've come across all kinds of coaches who've had success with all kinds of methods. Right? It's not the case that I run into some coaches who use a particular method who are consistently effective, and other coaches who are consistently ineffective with another method. The second thing here is that this is true in almost all cases, unless you are talking about a specific law. A law is something that we can replicate everywhere and is always true, right? Unless we speak of a law, extremist views are almost always nonsensical. It's almost impossible that an extremist view of something would be true. Saying that everything has to happen through a game is an extremist view. Saying that everything has to happen through rote repetition is an extremist view. Both of them are nonsensical. And the reason why they are nonsensical comes down to a simple thing that we understand as scientists reasonably well, and that's causation, right? If you have a simple explanation, then you are basically saying, if X, then Y. If
Mhm.
I practice these games, then I get X amount of improvement in performance. If I do 1,000 repetitions, I get 1% better. Those are very simple reductionist models. And in fact, I would argue that one side of that coin, right, the ecological side, or the ecological dynamics side that actually argues that behavior is a complex system, actually goes against their own arguments, right? Because this linear, simplistic, reductionist view of cause and effect, if I train this, then I get that, can't be true for complex behavior like sport. In fact, it should be in some cases when I do X and A, B, and C are there, but D, E, and F are not, then maybe if I provide a high enough dose of it, I get a performance improvement of X%. However, if I apply that same dose again, I don't get the same performance improvement and I might get nothing. But if I do it again, then again I get a sort of performance improvement. So in fact, what we see is that behavior can't be described by this simple cause and effect in the context of training. It is much more complex than that. And that's why I always argue, for me, and for coaches who are maybe listening to this and kind of grappling with, you know, do I need a theory to underpin the things I do? If you want to look at some theories that are really relevant, I wouldn't look at any of these. I would look at something called complex dynamical systems theory, which is a much more interesting way of describing the causation or how X causes Y. And in my sense, the moment someone says, this is the method that works, you should only use this method, and as a result, that will get you Y, that is almost certainly untrue. In fact, the first thing, and I do a lot of education for coaches and practitioners in this sense, the first thing I always teach them is that a coach's toolbox should span anything from confidence training. You can see rote repetition as building someone's confidence. It probably doesn't give you a huge latent learning effect, but it makes you feel confident. It gets maybe that automation of behavior. It gets you feeling confident with the kind of movements that are needed to produce a particular outcome. And they should have anything from confidence to competence training. And that competency training, that might be a lower repetition count, but more messy environments, maybe where the causation or the cause and effect relationship isn't that clear. It is maybe, doing or grappling against a live opponent would be a typical competency practice. As a coach, in your toolbox, you should have anything from extreme competence practice, what we described before, to extreme confidence practice and anything in between. And the skill of a coach, that's why they call it the art of coaching. The skill of the coach is to know when to take which type of training out of your toolbox to get the biggest effect possible. If you just had an athlete who's had a massive loss on the weekend in a few matches they've done, and you say, well, actually, what I want to do is I want to boost their confidence first, and I want to get them to do some rote repetition, not to punish them, but to get them feeling confident again in a certain move, or to get them to learn something new that they haven't learned before. There's nothing wrong with that. The moment someone argues that that is wrong, that doesn't make any sense, because there is no supporting evidence to say that a particular type of coaching, a particular type of practice design, always works in a predictable way with a particular or with a group of athletes. Because even when you'd say, look, as a coach, I feel more confident in this kind of ecological sphere. I'm not a very good kind of prescriptive instructions giver. I feel much more confident with like sitting at home, designing my practice, really thinking about how to manipulate the environment in order to get a functional like movement solution to emerge. That's great. If that's what you feel more confident with, that's great. But just understand that it's not because that's what you feel comfortable with, that that's also going to work with every single one of your athletes and work in the same way. That's what I said, right? If you take Newton's law or some mathematical equation, you can say that if you um, change the magnitude of x, you change the magnitude of y, right? In a particular equation. We don't have simplistic equations like that. That's not how behavior works. Behavior is much more complex. And that's why every single time I do this education, my first slide is one with a brain on it that says 50-50. 50% of coaching is scientific, has scientific underpinnings, but 50% is based on your experience as a coach. It's based on your perspectives, based on what you're good at. We can't fit a round peg into a square hole. Or a square peg into a round hole. I think it is, because you can fit a round peg into a square hole. But so we just have to think about these views, these extremist views, as that's what they are. They are extremist views, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between.
Yeah, I kind of, it's interesting because, I mentioned that jujitsu there's a mostly a recreational sport where we do have competitive athletes, but it's got a huge recreational, fun group of people that are the majority of people that practice. And so I've been doing it for 21 years. I've been coaching for about 18 years. And one thing that I've noticed is that like the people that I coach today are very different than the people that I coached 15 years ago. They're different than the athletes that I've coached. They're different than my own performance when I compete. The things that they need, the things that they enjoy. And so, what I find really interesting is that there are times where my students will really resonate well with a very constraints led block of classes for a certain amount of time if the material is of a certain nature, right? And then there's other times where, for example, right now I'm teaching a block of a certain type of jujitsu thing that it's hard to describe. Jiu-jitsu is like it's kind of like skateboarding, like where there are moves in jiu-jitsu or there's positions that become kind of trendy and fun. And like, with skateboarding, there's like 360 kick flips and, Tony Hawk does this and this guy does this. And so there's like the heroes of the sport and they do these moves and these moves become popular and trending. And what I notice is that sometimes my students will do really, really well with a specific type of technique or position if they really click with like certain high profile athletes that are doing it,
Mhm.
or if it's like a very trendy thing that they really like, they're excited about and they're like, whoa, like I saw that happen in competition over the weekend. I want to learn that. And so there's this motivational thing that I think you touched on a little bit, which is um, it seems almost inseparable from skill acquisition
Mhm.
where like I have these students who are right now doing in class maybe like 5 to 7 reps of this certain technique so that they can get a sense of how their body should move when they're doing it, and they're excited to do it and they're getting better at it, doing that and live work at the same time because they're super motivated by it and they're excited by the material. And so it seems like it's less about the actual method that I'm using to teach the material and more that they're just pretty excited and interested in the thing itself. And so
Mhm.
what that tells me as a coach is that, you know, motivation is such a powerful thing that it seems like in many cases, if you can find the thing that motivates and excites your students, the actual method that you do to pass that information or build skill in that person is maybe secondary to the thing that gets them motivated. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, and that's the big difference between professional environment and recreational environment. In a professional environment, your athlete has to come back the next day and
Yeah.
the next day because they're being paid to do it. In a recreational environment, the biggest way in which you control their learning is still, if you made a massively, long equation of all the things that affect learning,
Mhm.
if you would include actual practice, exposure to practice, even regardless of what that practice is, every other variable in that equation would like completely disappear, right? This is clearly the most important aspect to whether or not you learn, you perform, etc. And if you control that exposure to practice in a recreational environment, that means ensuring that someone wants to come back. Now,
Yeah.
some people could argue if someone needs to come back, it has to be fun, right? But what we sometimes do is we equate fun to playing games. That's not necessarily the case. Some people, and you used skateboarding before, right? Skateboarding is a typical example.
Hmm.
If there is ever a sport in which deliberate, purposeful practice with repetitions and kind of, in this case, not augmented but intrinsic feedback over and over, doing something again and again and again, if that is true in some cases, or in any case, that would be skateboarding, right? The way in which you learn a trick is to do it over and over and over again. It's also the way in which people naturally engage with it. You have 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds who are perfectly happy not playing a single game, but just trying something again and again and again. We
Yeah.
sometimes try to project our understanding of what we think should be fun onto our learners, but we don't actually know what our learners find fun. I find some things fun that others find extremely boring, right? Looking through literature, trying to find manipulations in figures to try and detect whether someone has gone through the effort of like fraudulently putting a image in their work, and therefore is a red flag of research fraud, is boring for 99.9% of the population, but it's extremely fun for me. For
Yeah.
other people, the rote repetition of doing something until it feels good, right? Even if that means that in a long term span, that might not equate to massive amounts of learning of the sport itself. If that is fun, that's why they come back the next week. If your toolbox only consists of a very particular type of activity, how can you ever cater for a public that is there for a wide variety of reasons, where the biggest thing you control as a practitioner to encourage their learning is whether or not they come back the next week?
Yeah, and they change too, right? Like for example, my own relationship with practice is, sometimes if I'm in like an off season and I'm not getting ready for a tournament, I enjoy repeating a technique and exploring how my body moves mechanically while doing it, and feeling little bits of leverage here and there when I grab an arm. And I enjoy certain types of rote repetition, and there's other times where I enjoy more live work and I don't want to do any rote repetition. And I'm 45 years old now, and when I was 35, my habits were very different, and when I
Mm-hmm.
was 25, my habits were even more different.
Yeah.
And even a month ago, there was stuff that I enjoyed that I don't really enjoy right now. And so it seems like, um, and I'm a professional. Like I've been doing this full time for 20 years. So if I feel like that, then I
Mm-hmm.
imagine that a bunch of students who, work, a 10-hour shift and then come into a class at the end of the night, and they want to come in and do some jujitsu and train with their friends, it would be impossible to pinpoint all of their motivations and all the things that they want to get out of practice and all the different things that will motivate them to keep on coming back. Some people
Mm-hmm.
like the social part of it and they just want to talk to their friends while they're drilling techniques. Other people like that, like problem solving, mechanically tinkering with the parts of a technique. Other people just want to spar and like kind of fight and get after it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you're describing is exactly what I said before. It's if you try to fit a simplistic model of cause and effect, if I train this, then I get this particular outcome, to everything you just said, you can imagine that that would only work for a very small minority of all the people who come to your gym, right? In the
Yeah.
same sense, what you said about the fact that this changes over time, you're different from when you were 35 to when you were 45. That is what we call time variance. It's also something that in this linear simplistic view of cause and effect, there's no room for time variance in there. But the moment you start thinking about cause and effect as something that's much more complicated, or much more complex is a better word, then all of a sudden there's time for this, or there's room for this time variance. And that's again why I'm saying that even if one of these methods, in 20 years time, if research finally, we get some robust research that experimentally investigates whether, for example, an ecological dynamics approach is better than kind of the standard method of how people coach, not the extremist view of like direct instruction and rote repetition, but something in the middle, like what most people do. Even if sometime in the future we get some of this evidence, it still doesn't mean that this is the best way to coach athletes. It might have been the best way to coach some athletes with a particular disposition, nature, interest, motivation, but it might still not be the best way to teach someone else. So, even in that sense, still extremist views will be nonsensical. There is no way that any of these extremist views can be supported generally in the literature, nor by logic.
Yeah, yeah. It's it's very interesting because in jiu-jitsu, like there have always been people who have experimented with different coaching methods. It's just sort of the nature of all sports, I think, where people want to experiment and find better ways to do things and find things that resonate with them and their athletes and their students. And so in jiu-jitsu, ecological dynamics and the constraints-led approach is becoming very popular right now. And I'm finding that, like, I'm friends with a couple people who use constraints-led approach primarily in their schools, and some of these guys are very sensible and they're open to, like, rote repetition and explicit instruction, just as, like, okay, these are tools in a toolbox, and we do primarily constraints-led approach, but there's a little bit of room for this and this and this if it's something that's going to make my students better. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
very sensible approach. And then, like you said, there are extremists in that approach who are a little bit, well, a lot more dogmatic and kind of insist that, you know, rote repetition and explicit instruction and things like that are just basically nonsense and have no part in the sport. And to be fair, I think there are some people, there aren't people in jiu-jitsu that go the direction of like only doing rote repetition and no live work, but
Mm-hmm.
there are people that veer more towards that spectrum of things. And I feel like when you say extremists, like there really are kind of these two polarities of different types of people in my sport and in other sports. And it seems like there's this big sea of like gray area in between, and most coaches fall into that gray area,
Mm-hmm.
but those coaches aren't really the loudest voices in the room.
Exactly. And that's what I'm arguing a lot, is that when you would look at actual practice, you would see very few people who are extremely dogmatic in one direction or the other. And
Yeah,
if if you follow this kind of understanding of dynamical systems, right? And just for the listeners who are not kind of familiar, one of the basic premises of this theory is that behavior emerges from the environment and the interaction with individuals, which is the ecological dynamics, like part of constraints. And it basically says that people settle into this very stable, efficient state of behavior, and that automatically becomes the best way for you to do things. So if we examine coaches' approaches to their practice, over time, most people gravitate more towards that middle, right?
yeah,
Because they settle into a practice that is efficient for them. It works for them to sometimes use this method, sometimes use some other method. And because we get a big bunch of people clustered there in the middle, it also argues that probably the best way of engaging in this type of training is to be somewhere in the middle. To be somewhere in the middle, or you can still be a bit more to the right or left, but not in any of these extreme camps. It just doesn't make any sense. And I'll just because of my background, right? Examining some of this literature in more detail, one of the things, for example, that is very common in kind of extremist views is the autonomy of a learner. In some pedagogical approaches, people argue that you should give your learner autonomy. In other words, they should be able to self-regulate their practice. They should be able to choose what they practice versus instructor-led practice, which is an instructor saying, now we're practicing 10 of these, then we're moving on to 10 of these, etc. Usually that happens in a kind of group sense, right? For a long time, this was something that we were taught everywhere. Every single coaching course, whether it was football or gymnastics or whatever, would have said, yeah, we should use this. It's called optimal theory, and part of optimal theory is the self-regulation component. We should give um, athletes autonomy about when they request feedback, what type of exercise they train, whether they want to move on from, training one grappling technique and they feel they've got it, moving on to the next one. Now, recent studies have investigated if they take all of the effects that are reported in the literature together, right, and they estimate, taking into account that most of the studies that were published were probably positive findings and some of the studies that were not published were probably null or negative findings, then we see that effect of self-regulated learning in the literature almost disappears. Right? So if you had this extremist view that self-regulation was extremely important in accelerating motor skill learning, not only were you probably adhering to a method that is highly unlikely to be true because it is, in a sense, extremist. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But now research is catching up and is actually showing that those effects that are reported in the literature all but disappear when you actually go and look at it with a little bit more rigor. So this is just to say that even if you truly believe that a particular method or a way of practicing, and that doesn't have to be, because I don't consider myself, I've written in the ecological dynamics sphere, I've written in the information processing sphere. I don't consider myself either of these, not in my practice nor in my research, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be any of these views. It can also be, self-regulation is everything. I only do implicit types of learning. I don't give any feedback. I don't use any augmented feedback, whatever it might be. Any of these extremist views, it is also likely that if you adhere to one of those, research in the future might show you that the effects that were estimated in the literature for interventions like that either become a lot smaller once we start examining them rigorously, or they disappear. So even if you try to argue that the research literature supports what you do, my argument for someone who's constantly in that research literature would be that we don't have enough rigorous research to even support some of these approaches. So therefore, I would say stick with the things that you feel good with, right? The things that work for you. And it seems like it's such a stupid solution because people say, yeah, but that's a cop out, they say. But it's not. It's a logical argument to
Yeah.
argue that if extremist views are likely nonsensical, right? And we don't have strong evidence to support these extremist views, and we have the understanding that there's no simple causal relationship between training and behavior, then the best thing to do is to stick with the thing that you feel good with.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like, I'm in this weird space where, like, I I've kind of inserted myself into this topic. Like, like I did a couple interviews with um, uh, Greg Souders, Mike Israetel, Cal Jones, like a bunch of guys who were pretty high profile in my sport. And I've, before maybe a year ago, like I've been familiar with ecological dynamics and a little bit of information processing theory and predictive processing stuff that I've read about over the years. And like, I've read about these things, but I never really felt any particular need to be like, I'm an information processing guy or I'm an eco guy. Like
Mm.
it never really seemed like the kind of thing that I needed to use to brand my coaching with. I always just
Mhm.
felt like I'm a jiu-jitsu coach these are interesting ideas. Some of these things make sense to me and fit my own personal experiences as a coach, and some of these things don't. And so I
Hmm.
never felt the need to like identify with any one of those theories. But what's interesting in jiu-jitsu now is there's sort of a push where there's almost like I guess if you're involved in this kind of space in jiu-jitsu, the skill acquisition talks, like there's a lot of pressure to try to like, you know, be an eco guy, or, you know, are you an information processing guy, or are you an eco guy, or are you a predictive processing guy? Like, what are
Hmm.
you? And most of us are just coaches. We're just like
Hmm.
normal jiu-jitsu coaches. But do you feel that, like, what is your take on that kind of topic? Like, do you feel that people need to identify with a particular theory, or can you, or is it, I mean, to me it just seems obvious, like that's just not how anything in the world really works. Like,
Hmm.
I don't go to a restaurant and the chef doesn't tell me that he's a, you know, he's a protein chef, or he's a, you know, like a carbs only I mean, I don't know. It
Hmm.
doesn't seem like people generally identify that way in the rest of the world outside
Yeah.
of like, politics. And so
Yeah.
it seems like a weird fit for jiu-jitsu where you would kind of, there would be pressure to wear a theoretical hat when really we're just coaches and practitioners. I know, with the chef thing, as soon as I said it, as soon as I finished saying it, I knew that that's stupid because that does exist in the culinary field.
Yeah. I guess to use your restaurant analogy, I think a lot of people who buy into I'm a such and such coach, or who build their entire practices on, a particular theoretical foundation, just like the chef who's a vegetarian chef cares about what their customers pay, right? And how many customers come into their restaurant. So it might be a drive not by their own beliefs, but a commercial interest. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Everyone has commercial interests, whether you're trying to buy a house and, upsell it later, or whether you're, trying to get more people through your door because you're an ecological dynamics guy. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The thing is, when you ask me, should you have a particular theoretical underpinning, my answer is no, because even if we would consider that scientific evidence and theory, etc., would contribute to more than 50% of your skill set as a coach, right? Let's say that rather than what I said before, it's not 50% science, 50% art, or 50% science, 50% experience, but 80% science and 20% experience. Even then, you have to think about what a theory is. A theory is outlining, let's say, a set of rules that we can either prove to be correct, or we have no we have no evidence, or we can do all kinds of experiments but eventually not find any evidence to refute that theory. So if you have a theory, right, what scientists do is they try and break this theory. All the predictions and hypotheses that are in that theory, we have to try and break them. And if we don't manage to break them over a very long period of time using robust and rigorous research, this theory is upheld, right? Just for the listeners here, just a basic perspective into what a theory is. So if we consider both of these, or like all of these different ways of using pedagogy as all kinds of different theories, even though some of them would be called pseudo theories because they're pseudo scientific theories because they don't actually have any testable hypotheses, but that's beside the point. Even if all of those are theories, right, adhering yourself to a particular theory by arguing that the predictions of that theory are true before we've done any sufficient rigorous research to try and break those theories and see if they are upheld under scrutiny would be completely unwise. So even if I would argue that there's much more relevance from science, from skill acquisition science, in the job you do as a coach, even then it wouldn't be logically sensible to adhere yourself to a particular theory until we've robustly tested the hypotheses that support these theories. For example, for information processing, there are some hypotheses within information processing that are robustly proven through research. For ecological dynamics, we don't have any of that because I'm looking through the literature, I'm trying to find the hypotheses that I can test in that theory, and I can't find them, right? I can find them in dynamical systems theory, which this is based on. I can find them in ecological psychology, but ecological dynamics in and of itself, to me, doesn't have any new testable hypotheses. So again, it's the boring answer almost everywhere, right? But the answer here is that just do your thing, right? Do what you've always done. You were doing this perfectly fine before you heard about ecological dynamics. The people who came to your gym were perfectly happy. They
Yeah.
were learning in a way that was beneficial to them. And that's probably the same for all of your colleagues. So don't feel the pressure and the need now to adhere to one of these camps. In fact, I will argue that once this disappears and once we get a bit more rigorous research, that is probably going to show that none of these extremist views are entirely true as hypothesized in some cases, people will move back to that middle anyway. You might as well stay there where you're comfortable and what you feel comfortable with. The fact that you feel this pull to kind of decide what kind of person you are is a clear sign that none of these would fit with you anyway. I'm a very pragmatic person in that sense. And in the same way, um, it's the same way I approach my own work. Pragmatism is really important because it allows us to, do things in the most efficient manner while at the same time not like completely committing to something, but waiting and seeing to see what research evidence will come up with in the next, decade or so. But yeah, for now, I don't see any purpose, and I'm sure, you know, and this is part of what I do as well and I do this particularly in the cognitive training space, right? There's lots of commercial tools, including, workshops, conferences that focus on this like very singular theory or approach to something, and then they're trying to sell you that this is the way you should be doing things as well. I would argue to people that there is no point if you don't feel comfortable with that. There's no point in engaging it. If you have the feeling that this is something that aligns so well with your own understanding of how we move, your own body, the way you've been doing things, that this is going to benefit you, by all means, like engage in it. But if you feel uncomfortable, or if you don't really know, or in many cases, I think I called it before, confuse, not convince, right? A lot of these theories use a lot of sophisticated jargon that I have to admit, I do this every single day, 10 hours a day, this particular thing, and I still don't get some of the jargon, right? So if some of these theories are trying to confuse and not convince, and you have that feeling, that's very difficult to buy into it until you understand all the vocab, etc. It's another sign that probably, this is not something for you, and you'd be, better off doing something else. Make your own pedagogy for that matter. If you make your own, there's no evidence to support that that would be any worse than adhering to anything that's pre-specified.
Yeah. It's interesting because you know, I over the years have kind of there's been a lot in jiu-jitsu because it's a recreational sport and because it's kind of like I don't know, like it's pretty popular right now. And every once in a while it kind of intersects with some like trending fitness things or trending
Mm-hmm.
exercise things or trending nutrition things. And so there's the talent code books come out and deliberate
Mm-hmm.
practice and natural movement for conditioning and kettlebells and some of these things are very helpful to a lot of people. But what ends up happening is these things kind of enter the sphere of jiu-jitsu and they become big. And then there's a certain subsection of people that are just like, you know what, this is the end all be all. Like natural movement, you got to lift rocks, you got to climb
Hmm.
trees, right? This is the only way. If you lift dumbbells, sorry, you're stupid. You got to lift rocks.
Yeah.
Or, and it's, um, and then, like you said, people become obsessed with it, and then it kind of fizzles out. And then if it's good, it kind of weaves itself within the fabric of jiu-jitsu and becomes like part of that gray area that we talked about.
Hmm.
And if it's not so good, then it just kind of becomes an afterthought or sometimes a joke, that people like goof around about. But, and so for me, I've learned over the years, having fallen for a number of these things, and like I've been one of those guys that's like, dude, yo, you got to climb trees, man. That's the way of the future, right?
Yeah.
Like I've been that guy, and I've caught myself like catching that fever, and then when the fever passes, I'm like, oh my god, like yeah, climbing trees is fun, but it's not the end all be all like I thought it was last month.
Hmm.
And so I'm really on guard for that kind of stuff right now, where when something starts to become part of the public consciousness of jiu-jitsu and becomes popular, I instantly am on guard. I'm like, okay, this kind of feels like that thing I fell for last time and the thing I
Hmm.
fell for before that. So might be good, but let me slow down and approach this with caution and sift through the pieces and see if there's something here. And so I've kind of learned over the years to become really cautious and not jump headfirst into it.
Hmm.
But I think like your advice that you just gave, I think is great for like coaches who maybe haven't been like, if that would have been great for me at 30, 31 years old when I was like going through my first bout of like mania climbing trees and like doing kettlebells and stuff, where like I needed somebody to just be like, hey, listen, this stuff is cool, but slow down a little bit,
Hmm.
see if it's something legit, let it kind of like, don't go all in, just approach with caution. And I feel
Yeah.
like with skill acquisition, as it's being sort of inserted into jiu-jitsu right now, I think that's a useful thing for a lot of jiu-jitsu coaches to think about, is like, these topics are exciting. There's different ways of approaching this. There's a lot of really charismatic people talking about these things in the public sphere, but it's wise to kind of slow down and approach with caution and
Hmm.
think about how this is going to play out. Like, how are you going to feel about this in 5 years?
Yeah. It's like getting a tattoo. If you
Yep.
overcommit to something, it's like getting a shitty tattoo. You're gonna regret it at some point, right? But
Yeah.
the thing is also the way you approach these things. If you bought into something to some extent, right? And I'm not saying commit in the sense of, let me give a very real example. You know, you're a real big information processing guy. Like you commit to it fully and you say this is the only way to train, and you call your jiu-jitsu company Information Processing Incorporated Pty Ltd, right?
Yeah.
Like you really commit to it. That that's not something that I would advise. But if you
Right.
just commit to exploring it, I'll give the example of something that in the same sense that happened to me when I did my PhD. I did a PhD on motor development, which is how children develop motor skills and how that relates to their talent for particular sports or their giftedness for particular sports, but also their adherence to sport.
Mhm.
And something that was really big back then is the early diversification versus early specialization debate. Should you, before an age of 12, try all kinds of different sports, or should you specialize in a single one? And the socially desirable response to this was always, we should diversify more. We should explore more different sports at a young age versus specializing in a single one. Because, and then my argument was, based on the literature, there is no reason to believe that early diversification isn't equally beneficial to early specialization. There's no difference between the two, right?
Okay.
Just to give people a perspective, that evidence was enough for me to support an early diversification approach. And while I still believe in the fact that kids should explore a wide range of activities, I now know that this is a belief of mine, but that we don't actually have super robust evidence to underpin that. Because to say that two things are equally good to one another, you need thousands and thousands of observations to support it. And I now know we don't have the kind of robustness in the literature. So for a while, I bought into this method. I still own an omnisports club back in Belgium. Well, own. I'm the founder. Someone else owns it now, but I'm the founder of an omnisports club, which I think is great. It's great exposure for kids to do all kinds of activities, compete in all kinds of individual and team sports, etc. And I still believe in the social value of an omnisports club like that. But because I bought into it early, I got a lot of good learning from it because it shaped my thinking. Now, it shaped my thinking in terms of the requirements I need, in terms of the robustness of evidence, before I say again, well, this is going to be much better than something else, or this is the thing that we should support 100% of the time, etc. So just in your case, right, thinking that climbing trees is the best way of conditioning or whatever it might be, it's not a failure. It's your exploration of the things that work for you. And it's only a failure if you don't take any learnings out of it. If you don't use that then to say, well, actually, some things of that related to that, which might be the variability that's related to the fact that not every tree you climb is the same. Therefore, you have to learn to solve certain solutions or whatever, right? If it's that you take away and you say, well, that's the thing I'm going to use in my practice, but I don't believe in this is the only way we condition part of it. That's part of your growth as a coach and as a practitioner. You should explore other methods. You just
Yeah.
shouldn't buy into them so much that you get a information processing guide tattoo on your back, because at the moment that just doesn't make any sense.
Like a tattoo of a robot.
Exactly. Yeah. Or a
um,
computer with a brain inside.
like a homog. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, yeah. So that's it's interesting because like what I did learn from that is that like I still climb trees because it's fun, right?
Hmm.
I still skateboard because it's fun. I still throw around kettlebells sometimes because it's fun, and like I get some benefits from stuff like that. But the one thing that I think the most powerful lesson that I learned from all that stuff um, is how much confidence I should have in translating how much I enjoy that thing to like telling other people that that's the way to live,
Hmm.
right? Like so it's you know, and I think maybe the confidence thing is what I see the most, where there's like really strong claims being made. Yo, you are going to become a tree climbing beast if you climb this type of tree 5 times a week.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the only way to be a well-conditioned athlete and blah 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 blah. But instead of saying that, like I've learned that like I can't make those claims because
Hmm.
there's no evidence to support those claims, but also I don't need to make those claims. I just like the thing that I like,
Hmm.
and like it helps me do certain things, and it might help you do certain things, and it's fun, but there really isn't that much. I shouldn't speak with more confidence than my expertise allows or
Hmm.
permits, I guess, is what I've learned from that. And
Yeah.
so like it's, I guess it's yeah, maybe uncertainty is what I've learned, and to be comfortable with uncertainty, and just like um to know like, okay, it's enough that I enjoy doing this particular thing. Doesn't mean everybody should do it. It's useful in some kind of ways, in this way, in this way, in this way. And I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but it kind of reminds me of something that I did want to ask you about, where
Hmm.
a lot of these kind of trends, the pattern of the trend is that they sort of become part of the public consciousness in fitness or in jiu-jitsu or whatever. Like, let's say tree climbing, for example, or
Hmm.
natural movement. And so it's a thing that becomes popular, and there's a brand behind it. Let's say like Tree Masters, tree climbing beast
Hmm.
guys, right? And then they say that it's scientifically backed. Like, okay, well, we have science to support that. If you do this type of movement, because it's natural and it's evolutionary movement, that you're going to develop more robust health and more dynamic movement, and you'll be capable of
Hmm.
doing way more different types of movement. And there's a lot of claims, and there's always like a scientific tag to it.
Hmm.
And then what ends up happening is guys like me who don't have an academic background in any kind of science say, okay, this guy's saying that there's scientific stuff going on here. And
Hmm.
like, I like climbing trees, and I feel stronger when I climb trees a lot because it's basically just doing pull ups. And he's got all these studies that he's throwing at me, and he says, this here's a study from like, you know, Dietzel et al. 2002 that says that climbing trees, it makes you
Hmm.
more, you know, hardy deltoids or something like that. And
Yeah.
but I have no way of like telling if that's bullshit or not. Like, so when somebody
Yeah.
throws science at me, I don't know how to tell, are these strong studies, are these weak studies? Is it just one study that hasn't ever been replicated? Are
Hmm.
they, you know, I don't know what any of it means. It just looks like science, and there's no way for me to argue against that.
Yeah. And that's a very good point, because scientific literacy, especially now when you kind of have large language models that indiscriminately hoover up all kinds of things on the web, right, and spit out something, the back end of it,
Yeah.
having that scientific literacy and understanding what is credible and what is not is extremely valuable. It is also extremely difficult. A lot of my colleagues who've worked in academia for decades don't have the scientific literacy that's required to do what you just said. So I don't want to disappoint anyone, but this is extremely difficult to do. Now, I always put this invitation out to anyone. If you ever read something and you want to know whether it's credible, send it to me and I'll happily look at it for you and give you an indication of how credible it is. So anyone can do that listening to this podcast. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
That's my, let's say that's my contribution to humanity.
That's very kind of you to offer
But
that.
yeah, but there's I mean there's a few rules that you can follow, right?
Okay.
So the first one is, if you look at something that is published, something that you can do is you can look at how many people the study used and what those people were like. So just to give you an example, if your tree climbing study examined all really highly conditioned athletes and it examined 12 of them and it compared tree climbing versus some like extreme method of almost doing nothing, then
Mhm.
of course you'd expect a massive effect, because not only is the sample size too small, you just can't. Experimental studies like that don't have at least, let's say, 20 people in each group, if it's what's called a between subjects design, right, where you have one group that just does this, one group that just does another intervention, then you just can't say anything robustly about the effectiveness of that intervention. So that's the first thing that you can look at. Did it study enough people? And also, what were the people like? If they were all well conditioned athletes and you're like me, you spend 12 hours of your day sitting down and you find 1 or 2 hours in a week to try and exercise, then that's not going to work for you, right? Because the
Yeah.
effect sizes reported in that study are not representative of the effect sizes you would see from that intervention in a general population. That's number one. You can always do that yourself, and that gives you a reasonable indication as to how much credibility you should put in this study. The second thing is, you should consider what's called conflicts of interest.
Okay.
And a conflict of interest occurs when you have any kind of benefit, financial or otherwise, related to the outcome of a particular study. Let's say that, Josh, your jiu-jitsu gym is known for applying ecological dynamics only, and you study an intervention in which ecological dynamics is posited against some other method, and you find that ecological dynamics works, but you don't declare that you have a conflict of interest. That means that you might have skewed those results. And that doesn't always happen consciously. It can happen unconsciously. You could have somehow provided better interventions to the people who were in your ecological dynamics, intervention versus your other intervention. That conflict of interest should be carefully examined by the reader. Now, that's not always clear, but what you can do is just have a quick Google of the authors and have a look at, are these authors who have shares in companies that, encourage cognitive training or ecological dynamics or anything like that. And if they do, you should always take the effect sizes with a grain of salt. Then the third thing and the last thing that you can do is your dial should always be set on skeptical,
Okay.
because, and this is for your listeners, the incentives for academics to publish things that work, the more sensational they are, the more likely they are to be published. No one cares about boring findings in scientific literature. Well, I care, but most people don't care, because boring findings don't get good readership.
Right.
Everything has a commercial interest. Sometimes, let's just give you an example. If I want to publish in a journal, and I want you, Josh, and all of your colleagues who don't have access to university libraries to be able to read my article, I pay $3,000, $4,000 to make this article what's called open access. Anyone can access it. My $3,000 or $4,000 goes to a publisher. That publisher doesn't pay people to review this article, just keeps that money. The profits that publishers make are larger than Google or Amazon, etc.
Yeah.
So publishers have a vested interest in publishing things that people want to read, because the more people read that, the more their libraries or whatever buy access to the article, the more money the publisher makes on the back end of it. So
Okay.
you have to be skeptical at any point, because our incentive to publish a lot of research, especially research that is sensational, our incentives are so large that the likelihood that we publish something that is biased towards the sensational is greater than bias towards the boring. So if you keep these three rules in mind, you can make a reasonable inference on whether a study is credible or not. If still at the back end you don't know, consult your academic friend or send it to me and I'll happily take a look at it. But the thing you have to remember is that, so for example, a study that I'm doing now is, you might be familiar with the reaction lights, right? There's all kinds of companies that sell these reaction lights. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at these companies' websites.
Is that like the lights
um,
that are like you put on a wall and you have to try to like touch them or something?
yeah, for example, you can put them on top of cones and then you touch them and you run to one direction,
Gotcha.
etc. So we're examining the claims, and in this case we're examining the causal claims. So if they say using these reaction lights makes you a better athlete, we're examining the literature that they put in their on their website in the scientific tab, or whatever science or about us scientific work or whatever evidence, whatever it might be. Any one of these commercial providers would have something like that, and we look at the literature and we see whether that literature can actually support the causal claims that the company is making. And I probably don't have to tell your readership, but in most cases, these causal claims are not supported. They'll just put whatever on there that is kind of remotely related to something they do, just to have more evidence. Because just like a good lawyer drowns the opposition in paperwork, a, a commercial company will want to do the same thing if they don't have clear scientific support for a causal relationship between their tool and performance, right?
Yeah.
Which, let's be honest, anytime you sell a product and you make a causal claim, you as a company should ensure that there is research evidence or robust evidence, even internal evidence that is robustly conducted, where you declare conflicts of interest, etc., that support those causal claims. But most of the time, it doesn't. So when you read things like that, right, that's why I'm saying you have to remain skeptical. When you go on a website and someone says, here's the 10 research studies that I used to say tree climbing is good,
Mhm.
you have to assume that most of these studies wouldn't be able to support the causal claims that are made that tree climbing makes you a better athlete anyway. And even for the few that are in there, if you would look at them with a skeptical lens, you would probably see a fair few issues. And that's not to say that everyone lies, but we have to remember Most organizations that sell a product have an incentive to at least obscure the truth. And
Right.
if you have a skeptical mindset, at least you can start there.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good starting point because that's, I mean, just using the skill acquisition talks in jiu-jitsu as an example. It's a big thing in jiu-jitsu right now, and a lot of people, will say stuff like this particular way of training is supported by scientific evidence, and then you have a bunch of jiu-jitsu coaches who, mostly we know about jiu-jitsu, but we don't know about science. We don't know about really anything in academia. So like I can talk to another jiu-jitsu coach and I'll say, hey, listen, I think that explicit instruction is useful in certain types of classes and I use it all the time and I get good results with my students. And then they'll say something like, well, all due respect, the science doesn't really support that. And in
Mm-hmm.
my head, I'm thinking, well, you know, we're both jujitsu coaches. Neither one of us know what we're talking about with the science. So how can you say that, right? And so you get into this thing where we both have like a low educational wall, and
Mm-hmm.
neither one of us are really qualified to really evaluate the science, and the studies and the research and all this stuff. And without a toolkit like the thing that you just provided, like those 3 points that you just provided, it's really hard to even know where to get started because, like,
Mm-hmm.
I'll go look at a study. Even I think you shared something on LinkedIn a couple days ago that was like a survey to fill out about
Mm-hmm.
like for, and I filled it out and I realized filling it out, I was like, Jesus, I don't know anything about this stuff. Like, there were
Mm-hmm.
sample sizes and there was p values or something like that, and I was like, I mean, I hope it doesn't speak too poorly of, of my lack of education, but like I had no idea about that stuff. And I'm filling this out. And I'm like, when I read a study, I guess I'm looking for like kind of conflict of interest sort of stuff that might be obvious, like you were saying. Like
Mm-hmm.
if the guy that did the study wrote a book about ecological psychology or about, information processing or whatever, then like, okay, he wrote a book
Mm-hmm.
about it. Maybe he's got some interest there. Um, or like I would have no way of telling if a study has been replicated or not
Mm-hmm.
because how would I
Yeah.
know, right?
And and just to give you an example that so the first thing is conflict of interests. Conflicts of interest are not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Hmm.
But when someone has a conflict of interest and they don't declare it, you have to wonder why they just didn't declare it, right?
Yeah,
There's no issue. In every scientific manuscript, you have a specific dedicated position, and your publisher asks you specifically, do you have a conflict of interest? And there is no issue if you say, yes, I own shares in a company that does exactly this. I have a conflict of interest. That's all that's needed. Then readers can go through it and say, well, given taking into account the fact that he has a conflict of interest, but he's done this really rigorously to ensure that that conflict like has no kind of bearing on the results. If you don't declare it, the question is, why didn't you? It's so simple to do. It
yeah,
doesn't cost anything. It doesn't take away from the rigor of the study, but you have a reason to not include it. And I forgot what the second point was, Josh, that you raised, but I had a
I think it was a p value thing
oh
or
in general.
in
So
that thing. Yeah,
so yeah, the fact that so scientific literacy, like I said before, it's really difficult to understand based on statistical information like sample sizes, p-values, the kind of language someone uses, etc., in their study to argue whether a study is trustworthy. It's really, really difficult to do. And in fact, this might be relevant to some listeners, but in August 2026, I'm releasing an open course, which basically is freely available to anyone who wants, which is on scientific credibility, which is going to give you some of these tips. How do I evaluate whether scientific work is credible. It's going to be about 4 or 5 hours. You can do it in your own time. It'll be online on a repository. Because this is a question I get so often, the thing that I get asked for second most of all to talk globally is on how to help practitioners evaluate the scientific credibility of published work. And the sad thing that I have to argue is that the incentives of academics misalign so much with publishing credible work is that your dial should automatically be the default consideration should always be in a conversation like the one that you said before, where people start arguing, yeah, but the research evidence says, which is something that lots of people argue, right? The dial should always be, I don't know if this is true,
Right.
just by default, just because our incentives to publish things quickly, there are, and this is for the readership that doesn't understand kind of academic publishing. There are people in our field who publish 60 papers per year. That's more than one every week if you don't take any annual leave, right?
That's a lot.
if you if you publish that amount of papers, there is no way that all of them are rigorous. So even if you would have the idea that academics are being paid to do rigorous work, their default setting should be to do only rigorous work and publish only work that is sufficiently rigorous, in that case, that can't possibly be true, because there is no way that you would even know what is in those 60 papers if you publish 60 a year. On top of that, there are some academics who publish every single thing that they publish with 10 affiliations. So they'll be affiliated to, and I'm just going to use some example, but the New York Stock Exchange, and then they're affiliated with, a local Christmas decoration shop, etc. And they have all these affiliations that all create like this interweaved complexity of conflict of interest. So therefore, every single study they publish, you have to kind of go, yeah, but did they write this because the person that they are, or the group that they are affiliated with, the local Christmas shop, wants you to say that Christmas lights are pretty? And is that why they said this? Because then next year they can get more funding from them? Or did they
Oh,
say it because this is actually what the evidence showed? And it saddens me to say that this is the point we are at. But even my own trust in the fact that all academics do work that is inherently rigorous and the best possible work that can be conducted is very low. And in fact, some of your, or you might have seen, or some of your readers might have seen, this year I do a big and we do about 8 workshops that are all available for free, that people can come and listen to, which are all about scientific credibility. What is a replication? What does it mean when a study is replicated? A recent study in sport and exercise came out that tried to replicate a bunch of sport and exercise science studies, and only was able to replicate about 20% of those. So in 20% of those, did they find similar effect size or even similar directions of effects, right? And we do all this education to try and educate people on the kind of basic scientific literacy that is required to understand what is credible and what is not. Next year, we'll do a whole different series, again, entirely available for free to anyone globally who wants to come and listen to it, listen to the recordings, whatever they want to do with it, which is all about bold ideas. People will come and present bold ideas about how to restructure science or the integration of science and practice to help us understand what is needed to become more trustworthy as scientists.
okay.
Trust is probably at an all-time low, in a sense that, and probably in your own country there's a kind of big, that was a big push towards, limiting the scientific credibility of some very rigorous research work, right? But even in my sense, the trust that I have in the average scientific work has decreased over the years, because I've learned more about what it requires to produce credible scientific work. And the amount of work that's required means that if you publish 60 papers, there's no way you adhere to these criteria
Yeah.
fully.
Yeah. I mean, even, in jiu-jitsu, for example, like when I teach, because there's so much material in jiu-jitsu, like so much technical material and positions, and I'm sure it's the same in pretty much any sport where there's just, sports are complicated, right?
Hmm.
And so when I teach, I tend to teach like on a specific topic for, 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. And when I do that, I do a lot of preparation work where I do a lot of film study of competition to see if these positions play out the way that I think they're going to play out for my students. And I study what my students are already doing on the training floor and see if this is going to be a fit for them. I see like what I think is going to motivate them and going to be of interest and enjoyment to them. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And it's hard to imagine that something like if I put that kind of work into doing, a class that is going to last 4 to 6 weeks, then it seems like something as complicated as a scientific study would take way longer than that. And so it's hard
Yeah.
to imagine 60 studies being published in a year because like I can't imagine doing like my work in such a short amount of time, like doing,
Mm.
60 different well-prepared classes in a year. And so it's hard to imagine that being something that somebody who's like, scientifically trained to do thorough studies being able to do without working 24 hours a day and,
Hmm.
being just crazy busy all the time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's
Yeah,
pretty much.
that's true. And I mean, and this might be another kind of tip for your audience, because I just thought of something else while you were saying that. So if we want to make a causal claim, right, about whether an intervention works or not, we use this particular type of study, which is called a randomized controlled trial. People might know it as an experiment. And basically, what it is you kind of pitch two conditions against each other. You randomize people into these conditions or into the order in which they are exposed to these conditions, and then you measure a particular outcome as a result of that experiment, right? So the only way we can make a causal claim is through a well-developed experiment, not just any experiment, but a well-developed experiment. And developing experiments takes a very long time if you want to do them well. So to give you an example, that study I talked about before on augmented feedback, Emma Petanchevsky, one of my students, she worked on it for 2.5 years. 2.5 years. That's um, 70% of her whole PhD was just working on a single experimental study practically full time,
Wow.
right? So it takes a long time to develop robust research evidence.
Mhm.
But if people look at the scientific literature, oftentimes people don't make causal claims from experiments. They make causal claims from what's called an observational study. If I walk into your jiu-jitsu gym and let's say that I observe your practice, I note something down about how well people perform, and then afterwards I go and ask them and I say, hey, do you like this pedagogical approach more or this kind of contrary one? I don't manipulate anything in your practice, but I just observe something. Right? If I do a study like that and then at the end conclude and say, well, this particular approach is better or produces better jiu-jitsu learning than this particular approach, then
Mhm.
I'm making a causal claim from an observational study, which is something you can't do. And in fact, if you look at the literature, a lot of the people who come to you and who say, yeah, but actually, I think that the scientific evidence supports that explicit instruction is better than implicit instruction.
Mhm.
There's a great likelihood that that evidence doesn't even come from a robustly designed experiment, but from some other way of studying people, oftentimes from an observational cross-sectional study from which you can't even make a causal claim, because we looked at the amount of randomized controlled trials that are in skill acquisition. That was the study that I started this conversation off with. We had 120 or 130 in total over all interventions,
Yeah.
right? So there is not actually that much work from which you can derive these causal claims in the literature. on sport specific training,
Mhm.
let alone that it would happen to be something that, happens to be extremely robust and well designed, that someone put a lot of effort into to derive these causal claims with a reasonable amount of confidence. I mean, once you get to the end of that kind of line or that chain, the likelihood that that study is actually supporting what they are saying is probably pretty low.
Yeah, that kind of touches on one thing I was curious about with transfer of like if I read a study from like 1993 about tennis players who I don't know, let's say the tennis players were able to um, experienced tennis players were able to wait a half second later before they hit the tennis ball, and
Mm-hmm.
inexperienced tennis players, you know, couldn't wait. They tried to hit the tennis ball way quicker or something like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then I try to take what I see in that particular study and then I transfer it to jujitsu. I think that's another interesting thing because a lot of these, I mean, I don't think there have been any studies done in jiu-jitsu of this stuff that I'm
Mm-hmm.
aware of, and if they have, there's so few of them that it's hard to imagine that they would have a lot of power to like
Mm-hmm.
really confidently explain anything. And so it seems like a lot of this, the research that people are bringing into skill acquisition in jiu-jitsu comes from other sports
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes not even sports, just other fields that might not really even have anything to do with jujitsu.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much transfer there is between these things.
Yeah. So for example, right, a common one is in the motor learning literature, we
Mhm,
have lots of really robust experiments that show things like, practice variability is beneficial for learning or a particular type of feedback, right? But what is happening is that we are applying these understandings about how someone by themselves in an isolated context, which is highly controlled in a laboratory, using a task that is highly controlled and super specific, like using a rotary dial or pressing a button or whatever it might be.
mhm,
We are trying to say that effect or effect size is representative of the effect size that you would observe for any other skill in any other population, who often, by the way, which is some of the work we're doing now, people never learn or almost never learn in isolation anymore. If someone learns in isolation, they still have a model somewhere on YouTube or on whatever. But most people who learn in the presence of with others who are trying to prevent them from learning this thing, if you often do opposed type of practice, right?
right.
So even in that sense, I would argue that if we find a particular effect, let's say that our effect is, and this, the effect size doesn't matter to the people who are listening, but let's say that the effect size is 5, observed in the motor learning literature of a particular type of practice variability. If we were to apply that to any other context, we would have to consider what the confidence interval is of that effect. So let's say, for example, that there's a confidence interval, and a confidence interval is if we were to do this exact um, intervention in the general population with a whole range of other people,
Mhm,
we are quite confident that the effect will fall anywhere between 4 and 6, right? That's a small confidence interval. That means that if we put anyone in kind of this same condition in the same lab, we can expect a similar effect. If we do studies in the context of more open skills or maybe in a team settings, these confidence intervals would become extremely wide. In other words, what they would tell us is that even though the effect in our study is still 5,
mhm,
the effect in the population, if we take any other population, any other, you know, person from the population in any type of context that is similar to this, the effect might be anywhere between zero point 0.1 and 100. Right? So we don't actually really know what the effect is. It's probably beneficial, but it could be super small or it could be super large. Right? So we actually, when we consider the transferability of the things we know in skill acquisition science to unknown or untested fields, we can't actually say much about that. There's a likelihood that it doesn't transfer at all, or
Okay.
there's a likelihood that it does transfer. And I understand in the context of, let's say, organizations that really have to drive competition, sometimes it's worth the trade-off of getting a few steps ahead of the competition by trialing something that is untested in that particular context but supported in another context. That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But when you're doing it in a recreational sense and the main goal is for people to learn, you are much better off relying on your own intuition and experience than relying on that research evidence that probably has very little bearing on your own practice. So again, I'm coming back to what I said before, is what coaches should really do is they should learn how to trust their intuition and their experience a lot more, given that it's such a big proportion of how much their athletes are likely to learn or how well they're likely to perform.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think like that I love what you just said about learning to trust your own intuition as a coach, because I feel that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you so much, because I listened to your podcast with John Mackey, I believe, a while
Mm-hmm.
back. And, the thing that struck me was just that um, I wasn't aware of how many question marks there were around all the scientific research. And, you sort of, when you're bombarded with a lot of scientific talk in as a sport coach, you sort of like, it makes you rethink everything. Like, well, okay, am I not paying enough attention to the evidence? Am I not doing right by my students because I'm not up on the current science as much as I should be? And then I
Mm-hmm.
listened to your podcast with John, and you know, it just hearing that, maybe the science is not as conclusive as people would make it out to be, kind of leads me back to think, well, wait a minute. I have 20 years of jiu-jitsu coaching experience. Like I believe myself to be a good coach. I've gotten good results for my students. My students enjoy the things that I do. And I do have a lot of faith in my own abilities, but I can imagine that a lot of coaches that are like me would sort of have I don't know, almost like it's good to second guess yourself sometimes, right? It's good to doubt
Mm-hmm.
yourself and to constantly work to be a better coach. But at the same time, still you still have to trust your own experience, because experience counts for a lot if you're in
Mm-hmm.
the sport for a long time. And so I think like the big reason I wanted to talk to you today was just to kind of, I don't know, maybe clarify that a little bit so that,
Mm-hmm.
coaches can feel more comfortable trusting their own experience, and maybe, you know, paying attention to the evidence and being informed by what evidence is available to them, but also, assigning maybe the proper level of confidence to the evidence that
Mm-hmm.
makes it into their coaching. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I can take an example of something that probably everyone's familiar with, right? Which is a few years ago, uh, video assistant referees were introduced into soccer, football, right? Before that, every single referee was required to rely on their own intuition, even when they were making what were generally considered 50-50 calls. Sometimes you don't know, even with the assistant referees there, you don't know whether someone actually touched someone else in the penalty box and therefore it was a penalty or not. It's an intuitive judgment. So a lot of the referees that were coming up at that time, they were being developed to rely on their intuitive judgment. And their intuitive judgments became pretty good. They were pretty good at making close calls. Most of the times,
Mhm.
referees are correct. Can you imagine how difficult it has to be with all of that information to be correct most of the time and
Yeah.
only be wrong in some like rare cases? Now, what happened is they brought into view or they brought into practice these video assistant referees who could basically scrutinize every single decision you made as a referee, I've worked with referees for a long time, and actually, I wrote something about this, and people can look that up. It's about something related to the intuition of referees. If you've been developed to rely on your intuition, and all of a sudden something is there that constantly questions that intuition, it becomes really difficult to do your job.
Yeah.
And lots of referees were reporting that even though the assistant referee makes the refereeing more accurate, it makes their job a lot more difficult because every single thing they do is being second guessed. So what happens if every single thing you're doing is being second guessed is you tend to be very cautious in your decisions, right?
Yeah.
You tend to take the decision that's going to offend the least people, that's going to be the least controversial, because then it can, like if someone's going to scrutinize it anyway. And that's what I'm saying in the context of coaching as well. You, as coaches, have been developed to rely on your experience and your intuition. If now all of a sudden we bring in a fairly imperfect science and we're going to say that's now going to replace a lot of the intuitive judgment that we had before, which was probably fairly correct in most of the cases, just like referees, you're probably fairly correct in your judgment.
Mhm.
My colleagues don't agree with me when I say that coaches are skill acquisition specialists. They are not skill acquisition specialists because they understand the science, but they are skill acquisition specialists because over time they have learned to understand through intuition and experience what works best for them, a particular type of athlete, a particular type of context, the learning of a particular type of skill. And most of the time, you are probably correct. If you are going to let that intuitive judgment be influenced by what is really a fairly imperfect science, you're doing yourself a disservice because you're decreasing the value of the thing you've spent a lot of time developing, honing, and sharpening, which is in most cases fairly likely to be a correct representation of the actual truth, probably more correct than what we can tell you through science. That's why most of the work I do as a consultant is I come into organizations and I build on the things they already do. I don't come in and I say, well, what you're doing now, training this quarterback in way X or Y is the wrong thing to do. I come in and say, great what you're doing already. Have you considered doing this or this on top of what you're already doing? Because
Right.
if I try to replace their intuitive judgment, coaches are such a good, think of, and I use the football soccer example just because this is fairly familiar to myself, but most coaches you see today are ex-players. They've developed this intuition being on both sides of the ball or both
Yeah.
sides of the field, right? We've hired them because of their intuition. All of a sudden, they come into a team, they make intuitive judgments, and we say, hey, wait a second, the GPS values are saying that you should replace this guy with another guy. The
Yeah.
GPS values or the amount of times they've done a jump or an acceleration is arguing that you should stop doing jumps or accelerations. And the coach will say, yeah, but I mean, I can see, and we're slowly getting to the thing that I really want them to learn in this exercise. And now you're telling me to stop. The moment we replace intuitive judgment with something that someone is not educated or developed to use. Remember, we hired them for their intuitive judgment, and now we're telling them, yeah, but now that we hired you, now you've got to make judgments based on something else. That just doesn't work. I can't see a
Yeah.
reasonable way in which that would be beneficial to the coach.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah. Um, so here's, I feel like maybe I've monopolized the conversation too much talking about jujitsu stuff. So I kind of like what can it's really cool what you're doing with trying to spread scientific literacy. I also have a lot of respect for, I mean, obviously you said there's great cost in making the studies that you've done free for everybody to access, like open access. Is there something that sport coaches can do to help you and help like your message spread and the things that you're trying to do? Because to me, these are all like really wonderful things that you're doing and
Mhm.
things that like I think they should be supported. And so like what can coaches do to help somebody like you who's trying to get scientific literacy to be more accessible to everybody?
I think the biggest thing they can do is prevent me from sitting in the ivory tower,
Okay.
because there's a real risk that I unconsciously lock myself up in the ivory tower and pretend like I know what it is like for coaches out there. Get us to talk at a local event somewhere. Get your local scientists from the university to come and do a talk in a kind of coaches sphere. Get them out of their tower for a little bit so they don't lose touch with what practice is like, because I can't tell you how many of my colleagues claim to know what things look like in practice,
Hmm.
but haven't been in a gym, on a field, in the context of sport or sport as recreation for a decade,
Yeah.
right? So get us in there, ensure that we understand what your needs are so we can ensure that whatever we do that is available to you is actually of benefit to you. If we end up doing it and it's of no benefit to you as an end user, but we claim it is, that's a mistake on us, right? So that's the one thing you can do. Ensure that we don't lock ourselves up. The second thing is, if you're interested in understanding whether or not science supports your own practices, engage with an academic about it. Ask the question. Most academics I know, so most practitioners I know will tell me, yeah, but I can't just email someone and ask them a question. Like, they'll never respond.
Mhm.
But most academics I know are saying, why is no coach emailing me and asking me about this stuff? Because I would love to engage with them, right?
Right.
So we kind of sit on these separate spectrums. While that shouldn't be the case at all. There are so many academics out there who are so willing to engage with the things that you find relevant and interesting without payment, without scrutiny, without, telling you know absolutely nothing about science, without stigma, without anything like that.
Mhm.
Just because, as part of our job, I think a lot of my colleagues will argue that the thing that's gone lost about our job is that is the return back to the community. Most of our scientific work is paywalled. Most of it, the education we provide is only provided to people who pay a lot of money for that education.
Right.
A lot of me and a lot of like people like me and my colleagues find that the most difficult part of our job, is that outreach into the community is so difficult. Sometimes it pays off to just reach out yourself. Look up, you know, who's in Philadelphia who does motor learning research. Ask them a few questions. I guarantee you that 90% of the people you email will respond to your email in a kind and sensible manner with things that are going to help you develop your understanding of scientific literacy, develop your own practice, etc. But sometimes as academics, we can't, like, we don't possess the skills to reach out to coaches, and it might be better for you to reach out to us
Right.
instead.
Yeah, that has been my experience. Like I've reached out to a few people, in for this podcast kind of thing, but also, just out of curiosity over the years. And generally the academics I've reached out to have been, as you say, like very, warm and eager to be helpful,
Yeah, and it's the same for me. I get a lot of requests. I respond back to every single one of them,
Mhm.
and like we discussed previously, I also get a lot of requests to go on podcasts, but I prioritize the ones in which I know they outreach back into the community, because this is the way in which I can argue that some of the knowledge I have by sitting in my office and spending hours and hours and hours on understanding this stuff better, this
Mhm.
is the way in which I justify my being for myself, that I can outreach back into the community. I have no interest in being on some commercial podcast for which people have to pay to access it. I
Right.
have an interest in being on a podcast that makes the podcast freely available to other people, that has an outreach into the community of people who are interested in learning about this stuff. And I think that's the case for a lot of my colleagues as well.
Cool. That's great. Yeah, I think it's your point about the ivory tower thing is fantastic because I find that happens in jiu-jitsu a little bit where I opened my own school 4 years ago with my wife, and one of the things that happens sometimes with jiu-jitsu instructors is they teach for a long time, and then I don't think everybody has to compete. Like jiu-jitsu is primarily a recreational sport, and competition is like a fun thing that some people enjoy and some people don't. But I competed for a long time, and what I've seen happen with people who used to compete sometimes is maybe they become a little disconnected from the experience of being a student and being a competitor and being somebody who goes out and wins some matches and loses some matches and then like gets back on the training floor and has to do the work that all the students have to do also to get better. So one
Hmm.
of the things that I did to kind of insulate myself from that is to start competing again a few years ago. And it's it's been really interesting because like, you know, I mean when you compete, you have your students that are kind of watching you, like maybe they're watching you on TV or they see your matches on YouTube or something like that. And like in your head you're like, wow, like these people, like if I lose I hope they don't stop respecting me or whatever, but like but you
Hmm.
get through that because you realize that they're just proud of you for going out there and doing it. But I think one thing that I enjoy about starting competing again a few years ago is that it really does keep me connected to my students and to what they experience on the training floor, because they can see me lose some matches or win some matches. And then when I come home on Monday and I get back on the training floor with them and I'm doing the same work that they're doing to get better, it, um, I don't know. I feel like it connects me with them better and keeps me like, it's not an ivory tower that jiu-jitsu people fall into, but it's whatever the jiu-jitsu version of that can happen.
Yeah.
And I feel like it keeps me out of that realm of like becoming insulated and forgetting what it's like to be a student of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and there's a real risk to forgetting what it's like, because over time, if you do it for a long time,
Hmm.
you start thinking that your reality is everyone's reality, right?
Yeah.
And I, let's imagine that that was me, right? And I wouldn't do all this outreach to improve scientific literacy. By the way, I think people who are interested in this, you can just send me an email. On the next session we have is actually someone who's an academic who comes and talks about how to maintain your integrity while working in industry. He works in Arsenal and Barcelona, etc., and he's gonna come and talk to that. So that's just a plug there. But like the real,
Sorry to interrupt
re-
you. Are you gonna post about that on your social medias?
I'll make another post on it. Yeah,
Cool, cool.
just because I think this might be particularly relevant for people in industry. But yeah, if we become this insular person who thinks this is our reality, we start projecting that reality onto others, right? And then after a while, you have no more idea that this is not actually reality. That's why I'm saying, a lot of my colleagues would probably benefit from stepping foot into a gym or on a field, just to realize that the reality they've created for themselves, where they can sit and work through problems for a long period of time, is not the same as the reality for a coach who has 10 minutes to listen to something on the way to their gym or their practice session, to try and understand how they're going to implement something in a next training session that is perhaps more evidence based, right? Their reality is very, very different to ours. And unless you keep touch with that reality, you always risk projecting your own reality onto that of other people. And then you get frustrated with, why can't a coach do the things that are actually informed by evidence? Right? You get frustrated about that. You get caught in that frustration, while actually the frustration is only there because you don't understand their reality.
Yeah. Yeah, what a great point that is, because that happens like as a business owner. That and because I've been doing jiu-jitsu so long, like I don't remember what it's like. Well, I do remember, but I haven't walked into a jiu-jitsu school as a brand new student in like almost 22 years, right? So I'm
Hmm.
pretty far removed from that experience. And so what I used to do is once a year I would take up a new hobby. Like I would go to a circus school and do hand balancing. I would go to a
Mhm.
rock climbing gym and start rock climbing. And I would do that because it would give me that feeling of walking into a rock climbing gym for the first time and seeing the people at the front desk and, did they welcome me when I walked in? Did I feel comfortable? Are the people that work there cool or are they kind of jerks?
Mhm.
What's it like to be a beginner again? And I found that that was super informative for me when I opened my own business because I could connect to like what does it feel like for a brand new jiu-jitsu student to walk into a jiu-jitsu school for the first time and feel like anxious, and are the people there going to be nice or not, or like what's it going to be like in there, and
Mhm.
yeah, I think maybe the thing that we're both talking about is just like having different ways of staying connected to the keeping your feet on the ground.
Yeah, yeah, and that's extremely important. Even for me, as someone who mostly works with like really, really high performers, sometimes I take on projects that are not with high performers at all because I have this anxiety about making my world only about working with high performers and no longer understanding what it is like for someone who's just not very good at a sport but happens to really enjoy it and love it and wants to play and engage with it, but they're just not very good, but they still want to get a feeling of accomplishment and
Yeah,
competency and learning out of a practice session, right? So yeah, I think we're talking about the same thing.
but how nice is that, right? Like, I mean,
Mm.
it because it's so tempting to think that the most important people for a coach to work with are like the high performers, like the competitive athletes, and and then it's easy to forget that like the person who might not be very coordinated when they walk into a soccer facility or a football facility or a rugby place or a jiu-jitsu school, um, and then you work with them and you see them like come in and they're kind of like anxious and they're not sure if they're going to be good at it or not, and maybe they're
Hmm.
not good at it, and then over the period of like a year of you working with them, like how cool a thing is it for you to watch them like fall in love with the sport and enjoy it and maybe get a little bit better at it, and like you know I think the falling in love with the sport is like the coolest part of that experience to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I mean, I really have to make myself do it, not just because it is so tempting to work with high performance, but also because high performance sport generates revenue for my own
Yeah,
business, right? I have a conflict there. While it is unlikely that, a recreational team or a group of recreational athletes generates the same type of revenue. So just like I guess lawyers engaging in pro bono work to understand what that side of the coin is like,
yeah,
in that same way I have to ensure that I don't lose touch with which is it's the biggest proportion of people, right? The biggest proportion of people are just people who do sport for the recreation and
yeah,
the fun of it, who might not be very good at it or are moderately talented at best. So to lose track of that skews my whole perspective towards everyone has to train like a pro athlete. And in fact, when you look at, the way, for example, youth sport is structured, a
mhm,
lot of it is structured in a sense that everyone has to train just like the pros are training, or
yeah,
everyone has to use the technologies the pros are using, right? So we already risk doing a lot of that. So we have to, this is why, as part of my courses when I teach at uni, I teach understanding research, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand fallacies and biases and unconscious biases and how they affect your understanding of the world around you. And unless you make yourself consciously aware of those biases or those fallacies, there's no way of overcoming them. They're unconscious for a reason, right? You have to make them conscious to understand them. And even when you make them conscious, you have to realize that you probably still have lots of unconscious biases, and there are lots of fallacies in your reasoning that you don't know about,
yeah,
right?
yeah. That's it's interesting because with jiu-jitsu schools it's kind of what you said about the high profile athletes being the ones that are your main financial support, I guess you could say. With
Mm-hmm.
jiu-jitsu schools it's kind of the opposite because the high profile, because there's so little money in the competitive sport of jiu-jitsu. Most jiu-jitsu schools are, supported by recreational practitioners. And so
Hmm.
for me, it's wonderful because like those are my favorite people because like I've worked with professional athletes before in a coaching capacity, but recreational students, like for example, I have one person I'm thinking of, and he comes in maybe 3 times a week, and he's got a highly stressful job, and he's got a family, he's got 2 kids, and he could be doing anything else. He could go home after work and have a nice relaxing dinner and kiss his kids on the head and put them to sleep and read them a story, but he
Hmm.
chooses to come and do jujitsu, right? And so to me, I feel like as a coach, like I have to give my best to that person because he could be
Hmm.
doing anything else in the world, but he chooses to financially support the gym and also with his time support the gym and show up and be part of the community. And so it's so interesting because the model of coaching in jiu-jitsu just seems like such an inverse kind of thing where it's like the recreational people there's so much access to them, whereas the high profile athletes, they're not the ones supporting the gym, and
Hmm.
also they're kind of this different category of practitioners in the sport.
Yeah, and this is why when we come back to something we said before, this is why the most important thing that you can do in a pedagogical sense is ensure that these people keep coming back, even from a financial perspective, not just because you love to see them learn, but
Yeah,
even from a financial perspective, it's important for you to provide them with training, practice that both ensures competency but also ensures confidence. If you don't have a coaching toolbox that can do both of those things, you can't be viable as a business, even I would assume in this sense. So
yeah,
even then, it even makes more sense to control that one variable we all know is hugely valuable, and that's exposure to practice. How often they come back, how often they engage with your gym and your practice. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. Round circle.
yeah, yeah, full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like you've been so generous with your time. I mean, we've been talking for 2 hours. Can you believe that?
Ah, yeah, I didn't even look at the clock yet. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I can probably talk about this stuff all day. So in that sense, it's nothing unusual for me. But yeah, I just want to say thanks for your hospitality, for having me, and for kind of broadcasting my voice to the people who listen to this podcast, and to the people who listen to it. I'm looking forward to meeting you one day, or to getting some correspondence from you, and to maybe corresponding back and forth about some of these topics that you might find particularly interesting. And I think, Josh, I don't know if it's possible, but I'll give you my work email, and you can publish that alongside the notes with this podcast.
that'd be fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. And yeah, I mean, really, send me anything that you want me to share with people. Like, I want people to do whatever they can to support the stuff that you're doing, um, and to take advantage of the free and paid resources that you offer because you're a professional, and but also you're very generous with the resources that you offer. So I think there's a lot there that people could really benefit from, and then especially that course that you mentioned come out in 2026.
Yeah.
I think people will really benefit from that. So yeah, if maybe send me like I mean I can put your LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff, but if there's other social media or emails or anything like that you want me to share with people, just send them to me and I'll put them up.
Yep. Sounds good. Well, thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Yob. Have a good. Oh wait, it's early in the morning for you, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've got the rest of the day still.
All right, well, enjoy your day, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, keep in touch, man. And if you're ever in
Sounds
Philly, come
good.
visit me.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, have a good day.
All right. See you. Bye
Okay,
bye.
bye.